They said Damon didn't fall for anyone. He was untouchable, the undisputed leader of the gangs that ruled the prison. Yet from the moment I arrived, his eyes were on me. I didn't understand it, why someone as powerful and feared as him would notice someone like me. A quiet, 24-year-old, just trying to survive. I thought I could avoid him, that I could stay under the radar. But Damon had other plans, and no matter how hard I resisted, he wouldn't take no for an answer. This is the story of how he took me and made me his woman. If you've ever wondered how love, power, and survival can collide in the most unexpected places, this story will keep you hooked. Make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Let's dive into a world where danger and desire go hand in hand. Damon. The name carried weight in the penitentiary, whispered in cautious tones by everyone who called this place home. He was the chief of the gangs, the one who ruled these walls with an iron fist, and for reasons I couldn't comprehend, he'd set his sights on me. I'd only been here a few days, just another face in the sea of inmates, but something about me had caught his attention. Damon, the man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, was drawn to me in a way that made my pulse race with both unease and something I didn't want to name. I stood at the gates of the penitentiary, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, feeling the cold weight of reality settle in. The towering concrete walls loomed above me, barbed wire glinting ominously in the afternoon sun. It felt like stepping into another universe, one where the rules I'd known no longer applied. I was 24 years old, young enough to still believe I had time to turn things around, but old enough to understand the gravity of my mistakes. "Move along," barked one of the guards, his voice echoing off the barren courtyard. I nodded and followed his lead, my heart pounding. Every step felt heavier than the last, my eyes darting to the groups of men lounging near the basketball court or huddled in quiet corners. Their stares burned into me, assessing, judging, and categorizing me before I'd even spoken a word. Inside the building, the air was thick with tension and the faint smell of disinfectant. The guard handed me a uniform and directed me to my cell, muttering something about keeping my head down and staying out of trouble. Easy for him to say. Trouble was everywhere, in a place like this. My cellmate was an older man named Carter. He barely looked up from his book when I entered, offering nothing more than a grunt in acknowledgement. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for conversation. I just wanted to survive. Days turned into a week, and I began to learn the unspoken rules of the prison. Stay in your lane. Don't look too long at anyone. And whatever you do, avoid eye contact with Damon. Broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, he carried himself with an air of authority that made it clear he was untouchable. But it wasn't just his reputation that made him stand out. It was the way he watched me, his gaze lingering longer than it should. It started subtly, a nod in my direction as I passed by, a lingering glance during meal times. At first I thought I was imagining it. Why would someone like him even notice me? I was just another new guy, trying to keep my head down. But then came the encounter that changed everything. I was in the library, a rare, quiet refuge, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, when he appeared. He leaned against the doorway, his presence filling the small space. The other inmates scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving me alone with him. "You're the new kid," he said, his voice low and smooth. I looked up, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, that's me." He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "What's your name?" "Elliot," I replied, barely above a whisper. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that made my stomach twist. "Elliot, welcome to my world." I didn't know what to say. His gaze was intense, unyielding, and for a moment I felt like he could see straight through me. I wanted to look away, but something about him held me captive. "You're different," he said finally, as if he'd reached a conclusion only he could see. I like that. My heart raced. "I'm just trying to get through my time here," I said, attempting to sound indifferent. "We'll see about that," he replied, turning to leave. "Stay out of trouble, Elliot." I watched him go, confusion and unease swirling in my chest. What did he mean by that? Why was he paying attention to me at all? Questions buzzed in my mind, but I had no answers. That night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't shake the memory of his gaze. There was something about Damon that was both magnetic and terrifying. I told myself to forget about it, to focus on keeping my head down and staying invisible. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Not anymore. The days after my encounter with Damon felt different, charged with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Everywhere I went, I felt his eyes on me, like a weight I couldn't shake. It wasn't overt. He wasn't the type to make a spectacle of himself, but it was there, subtle, persistent, and undeniably intentional. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. Damon might have noticed me, but I was just another inmate in his world. I'd seen him in the yard, surrounded by his crew, commanding the space like a king on his throne. Men hung on his every word, eager to please, desperate to avoid his wrath. I wanted no part of that. But Damon wasn't the type to let things go. It started during breakfast one morning. I was sitting alone, keeping my head down as usual, when one of his men approached. He was tall and lean, with a shaved head and a scar running down the side of his face. He dropped a tray on the table in front of me and sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Elliot, right?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I glanced at him warily. "Yeah." "The boss wants to see you." My stomach dropped. "The boss?" He smirked. "Damon. He's got a spot for you at our table." I hesitated, the fork in my hand suddenly feeling like a lead weight. This was exactly what I didn't want, to be pulled into Damon's orbit. But refusing wasn't an option. Not here, not with someone like Damon. "Okay," I said quietly, setting my tray aside. The man led me across the room, the chatter of the cafeteria fading into the background as we approached Damon's table. He sat in the center, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. The other men at the table moved aside as I arrived, creating a space directly across from him. "Elliot," Damon said, his voice smooth and steady. "Glad you could join us." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension in the air was thick, and I felt every pair of eyes at the table on me. "You've caught my attention," Damon continued, leaning forward slightly. "That doesn't happen often." I swallowed hard. "I'm not sure what you mean." He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "You will." The conversation shifted after that, the men around the table laughing and talking like it was any other day. But I couldn't relax. Damon's gaze never left me, and every time our eyes met, I felt a jolt of something electric. After breakfast, I tried to return to my routine, but Damon wasn't done with me. His men intercepted me again, guiding me to the yard where he was waiting. "You're not like the others," he said, his tone casual as we walked along the perimeter. "You don't try to prove yourself, but you don't cower either. I like that." I didn't know how to respond. Compliments from Damon felt like traps designed to lure me into something I wasn't ready for. "I'm just trying to keep my head down," I said finally. He stopped walking, turning to face me. "That's not going to work, Elliot. Not with me." There was something in his tone, a mix of authority and challenge, that made my heart race. I wanted to argue, to tell him to leave me alone, but the words wouldn't come. "You're different," he said again, his gaze piercing, "and I'm going to figure out why." Before I could respond, he walked away, leaving me standing there with my thoughts spinning. That night I lay in my bunk, replaying the day's events in my mind. Damon's words, his gaze, the way he seemed to see right through me. It all felt like too much, but at the same time I couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about Damon that drew me in, even as I tried to resist. In the days that followed, he continued to find ways to pull me into his orbit. A nod in the yard, a seat at his table, a casual remark that lingered in my mind long after he'd said it. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I wasn't interested in whatever game he was playing, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Damon had a way of getting under my skin, of making me question things I'd never thought about before. And as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me was starting to wonder what it would be like to let him in. Damon's attention was no longer subtle. It became a constant presence. And no matter where I went or what I did, he found a way to remind me that he was watching. At first, it was unnerving, but as days turned into weeks, I began to notice something unexpected. I wasn't just afraid. I was curious. Every interaction with him felt like a test, like he was peeling back the layers of who I thought I was, one deliberate moment at a time. He would ask questions, personal ones, that no one else in this place had ever cared to know the answers to. "Where are you from, Elliot?" Damon asked one afternoon, leaning casually against the wall in the yard. "Chicago," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He nodded thoughtfully. "Family still there?" I hesitated. "Yeah, my mom and sister." Damon's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of something almost human breaking through his usual stoic expression. "You miss them?" I didn't answer right away. It felt dangerous to admit any vulnerability in a place like this, especially to someone like him. But there was something in his gaze that made me feel like it was okay, like he wasn't going to use it against me. "Yeah," I said finally. "Every day." For a moment we just stood there in silence. It wasn't awkward, though. It felt strange, like he understood. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. Damon straightened up, the mask of authority slipping back into place. "Stay close, Elliot," he said before walking away. "This place isn't safe for someone like you." His words stuck with me long after he'd left. What did he mean by that? Why did he care if I was safe or not? The incident, things escalated a few days later during a heated basketball game in the yard. Tensions were always high in games like these, where pride and ego were on the line. I'd been watching from the sidelines when a fight broke out between two inmates. It was chaos. Guards rushed in, but before they could regain control, one of the players turned his anger on me. "What are you looking at, pretty boy?" he spat, stepping closer. I tried to defuse the situation. "Nothing, man. I'm just here." "Yeah, you're just here," he sneered, shoving me backward. "Like you belong, but you don't." The shove sent me stumbling, and the world around me seemed to freeze. I wasn't a fighter. I didn't know how to handle this. Before I could react, Damon appeared out of nowhere. He stepped between us, his presence like a force field. The other man froze, his bravado evaporating in an instant. "You got a problem?" Damon said, his voice calm but laced with danger. "No," the man stammered, backing away. "No problem." Damon didn't move until the man was gone. Then he turned to me. "You okay?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Don't let them see fear," he said quietly, his tone almost gentle. "It gives them power." I wanted to say something, to thank him, but the words caught in my throat. Damon just shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Come on, let's get out of here." That evening, as I lay in my bunk, I replayed the events of the day over and over. Damon's actions, his words, they didn't make sense. He didn't need to step in for me. He had nothing to gain from it, and yet he had. The next day I found myself sitting with him in the library, the quiet hum of the space a stark contrast to the chaos of the yard. We didn't talk much, but there was a comfort in the silence. At one point our hands brushed as we reached for the same book. It was a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through me like an electric current. I pulled my hand back quickly, my face heating up. Damon noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Elliot," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not afraid," I lied, my eyes fixed on the table. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. This time, I didn't pull away. "You're different," he said softly, the words carrying a weight I didn't fully understand. And I like that. For the first time, I didn't try to argue. Things weren't supposed to escalate. But they did. Damon had a way of closing the distance between us, both physically and emotionally, in a way I couldn't escape. And maybe, deep down, I didn't want to escape anymore. But the prison wasn't a place for vulnerability, and the world around us was always ready to shatter any fragile connection we tried to build. The yard was buzzing with tension one afternoon, a rumor spreading like wildfire. A rival gang was planning something. What exactly? No one seemed to know. Damon, of course, was aware. He had his men watching, reporting back, but even he couldn't predict everything. "Stay close today," he said to me as we sat in the far corner of the yard. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down my spine. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He looked at me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Because I said so." I didn't argue. There was something about the way he said it, the certainty in his tone, that made it impossible to question. The attack, it happened fast. Too fast. One moment, the yard was its usual cacophony of noise and movement. The next, it erupted into chaos. A fight broke out near the basketball court, and in the blink of an eye, it spread like wildfire. I was shoved backward, caught in the surge of bodies. I barely had time to react before someone grabbed me from behind, their arm locking around my throat. "Where's your boss now, huh?" the man hissed in my ear. I struggled, panic clawing at my chest, but his grip was like iron. I thought this was it, that I wouldn't make it out of this alive. Then I heard Damon's voice. "Let him go." The man froze, his grip loosening just enough for me to catch my breath. Damon stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes burning with an intensity that could melt steel. "Don't make me repeat myself," Damon said, his tone deceptively calm. The man hesitated, then shoved me forward. I stumbled, falling to my knees, but before I could fully register what was happening, Damon was there. He moved like lightning, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You think you can touch what's mine?" Damon growled, his voice low and deadly. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. What's mine? The guards broke it up moments later, dragging the other man away. Damon helped me to my feet, his hands steady on my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. I nodded, though my legs felt like jelly. "You need to listen to me, Elliot," he said, his gaze piercing. "This place isn't just dangerous. It's a war zone, and if you're not careful, you'll get caught in the crossfire." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded again. The confrontation later that evening, Damon found me in the library. It had become our unofficial meeting place, a rare pocket of quiet in the chaos of the prison. "You scared me today," he said, sitting across from me. I blinked, surprised by his honesty. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You don't get it, do you? I don't just look out for you because I have to. I do it because I want to." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Why?" "Because you're different," he said simply. "And because I see something in you, something worth protecting." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because part of me wanted to believe him. Damon reached across the table, his hand resting on mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "You don't have to fight me, Elliot," he said softly. "I'm not your enemy." For the first time, I let my guard down, just a little. The walls between Damon and me were crumbling, and I didn't know if I wanted to rebuild them or let them fall. His presence was overwhelming, but it wasn't just his power that drew me in. It was the way he saw me. Not as another inmate or a lost soul trying to survive. He saw me, Elliot, in a way no one ever had. One night, he found me in my cell. Carter, my cellmate, had been transferred, leaving me alone for the first time. Damon stepped inside, his broad frame filling the space, and closed the door behind him. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. "I'm not," I started, but he cut me off with a look. "Don't lie to me." The intensity in his eyes made my throat go dry. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but I couldn't. "I don't know what you want from me," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you do," he replied, stepping closer. I backed up until I hit the wall, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. "I want you, Elliot," he said softly, "and I think you want me, too." I couldn't deny it anymore. The truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and terrifying. The moment of truth came quietly, in the stillness of the night. Damon had been patient, far more than I ever expected someone like him to be. He didn't demand or pressure. He simply waited, like he knew that eventually I'd come to him. And maybe he was right. The cell felt smaller with him inside it, his presence commanding every inch of space. He stood near the bunk, his dark eyes watching me with a mix of intensity and something softer, something I couldn't quite name. "Why me?" I asked finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for what felt like hours. Damon didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bunk, his hands resting on his knees. "Why not you?" he said, his voice low but steady. "You're different, Elliot. This place hasn't hardened you. It hasn't taken your kindness or your humanity. That's rare here. I looked away, unsure of how to respond. His words felt too big, too much for someone like me to carry. I'm just trying to survive. You're doing more than that, he said, his tone softening. You're reminding me that there's more to life than this place. I frowned, turning back to him. How? I'm nobody. I don't have anything to offer you. He stood then, crossing the small space between us in a few strides. When he reached me, he cupped my face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. Don't say that, he said firmly. You have no idea how much you've already given me. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my resolve crumbling. Damon didn't move, didn't push for more. He just stood there, holding my face like it was something precious. And in that moment, I realized something I'd been fighting since the day I arrived. I didn't just want him. I needed him. I don't know how to do this, I whispered, my voice trembling. Then let me show you, he replied, his lips curving into a small smile. What followed was nothing like I expected. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was deliberate, each moment unfolding with a tenderness that felt foreign in a place like this. Damon didn't just take. He gave. He gave me his patience, his understanding, his strength. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. Safe to be vulnerable, to let my guard down, to feel something other than fear and survival. And in Damon's arms, I found a kind of freedom I hadn't known I was capable of. Afterward, we lay on the narrow bunk, the silence between us comfortable. Damon's arm was draped over my waist, his breathing steady and calm. Are you okay? He asked quietly, his lips brushing against my temple. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Yeah, I think I am. He chuckled softly. Good, because you're stuck with me now. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. I think I can live with that. Of course, nothing in the penitentiary stayed quiet for long. Word of our connection spread quickly, and with it came new challenges. Some inmates whispered, others sneered, and a few even tried to test Damon's authority. But Damon wasn't just a leader, he was a protector. He didn't let anyone challenge what we'd built, and for the first time I felt like I had someone in my corner. One day, as we sat together in the yard, he leaned closer, his voice low. They're watching us, he said, nodding subtly toward a group of inmates across the way. Let them, I replied, surprising myself with the confidence in my tone. He smirked, clearly pleased. That's my boy. Hearing those words made my chest swell with something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Our connection didn't erase the reality of where we were or the challenges we faced, but it gave me something to hold on to. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. And in a place as dark as this, that was everything. Damon and I didn't make promises. We couldn't. The world we lived in didn't allow for guarantees, but every time he looked at me, every time he reached for my hand or stood by my side, I knew we were building something real. And in the end, that was enough. In this place of chaos and survival, I found something I never expected: love. Damon didn't just claim me, he taught me to claim myself. Our story isn't one of perfection, but it's real. And in a world like this, that's all we could ask for. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What would you do if love found you in the most unexpected place? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge the boundaries of connection and survival.